So the next part is to talk about songs as a substrate or algorithm for life and mind. So adaptation by natural induction establishes that natural selection is not the only mechanism of adaptation. It doesn't have to be selection-based. It can be purely transformational. So what else can do this kind of transformational adaptation? Natural selection depends on self-reproducing entities, which we might think of as particles. Natural induction depends on a network of viscoelastic connections between entities. How about songs? Can songs do the same kind of transformational adaptation? What's needed for this kind of transformational adaptation? The underlying principle is just relaxation that's occurring in a folded and an unfolded space simultaneously, a high order relaxation. And the folding of the space is also a relaxation of the higher order space. It has a lovely sort of recursive sort of geometry that movements in multiple spaces, transformation in one space into another, the folding and back again, the unfolding. It's almost like reality is already both folded and unfolded, as Bong would say. You just have to catch it at the right moment to tune in to the folded state or the unfolded state, which frequency your phasoscope is viewing. You can see it one way or see it the other, depending on the frequency of your strobe, because both are true simultaneously. Time is nested. So what's needed for that kind of transformational adaptation? To get us thinking in the right way, I want to show you my favorite optical illusion. You're supposed to look at the cross in the middle. And what you might notice is a green dot that's circling around and there aren't any pink dots left. If I pause the video, there isn't any green dot. There's just a gap in the pink dots. And then there's a gap at the next position, and then there's a gap at the next position. But as you run the video forwards, it appears to be a green dot that sweeps around and collects up all the pink ones, which are then sort of explained away as though they were just afterburn of the green dot. Isn't that cool? I love that. Why am I showing you that? Maybe we don't need particles. Maybe what's there and what's not there are both just as real. Maybe the substance ontology and the relational and processual ontology are both just as real. Also, I love it because note that when you try to look directly at the green dot, you can't see it. It falls through your fingers or falls between your eyes, as it were. I love that illusion. So my intuition is that natural induction does the same stuff as natural harmonization, or rather the natural harmonization does the same stuff as natural induction. We already know that the simple principle of positive feedback on correlations provides a global adaptation ability in the context of neural networks. And we already know that you can do that with viscoelastic connections in a dynamical system without being designed or selected for the purpose of doing that. And my suggestion is you can also do that with positive feedback on resonance, that the more two things resonate, the more their internal geometries change to make them resonate more easily in future. That harmonization principle produces the same global adaptation ability as positive feedback on correlations in a neural network or in the masses connected by springs. So let's flesh out that equivalence. In natural induction, we have some states, the position of the masses and the lengths of the springs. The springs or the connection strengths, which determine the dynamics of the states and are determined by the position of the states. And we have a learning process which changes the connections, changes the organization of the system. In natural harmonization, the state is going to be phase differences. Low order structure is going to be short wavelength phase differences, and high order structure is going to be long wavelength phase differences. The strength of a connection is going to be the strength of resonance between coupled oscillators, which, by the way, is going to be quantized to whether they're, if they're 1-to-1, it's a strong spring. If they're 1-to-2, it's a weaker spring, and so on. And harmonization is the dynamical process that reorganizes the strength of resonance, because entities that resonate are pulled into harmonic natural frequencies, They change their internal geometry. It's a transformation process, a change in the internal phase locking ability. Okay. So when you do computation in phase space, everything is relational and time dependent, not absolute and static. We're not talking about this value is true and that value is false. We're talking about the value of this one is the same or opposite to the value of that one. That's the relational part. Or the time dependent part, when this value is true, that one is false. Or if you go up a level, you can say, well, this relationship is positive or that relationship is negative, but that's just a higher order state. You ought to be saying things like this relationship is positive when that relationship is negative, and so on. But interestingly, there are also always in-between states. The in-between states are the states which show up when stressed, that things are not binary. And that's going to be crucial for the reversibility. So some basics. When one oscillator meets another oscillator of the same frequency, and they oscillate in phase, we can represent that as the positive correlation. When they are out of phase, we represent that as a negative correlation. And the Lissajous figures that I showed you earlier are the extremes of being in phase, 0 phase difference, or out of phase, pi phase difference. When they are the same frequency, they are a two-dimensional relationship. Was there something else I needed to say there? Oh yeah, the two-dimensional orbit, the circle, allows two components to agree or disagree or coexist at different times depending on its rotation in the third dimension. So instead of thinking of the positive correlation line as a line and the negative correlation line as a line, think of them as particular two-dimensional projections of the circle that's being rotated in a three-dimensional space. That's what happens when you change the phase of things. Things which are in agreement are waves that positively build up. Things that are in contradiction are waves that cancel out. When you're true, I'm false. And things in between, what's that? Well, that's neither contradiction nor agreement. It's halfway between the two. It means when you're decided, either true or false, I'm undecided. I'm neither true or false, and vice versa. That's the two-dimensional concept, the circle, that gets rotated in the three-dimensional space. Here's a little video of a circle changing back and forth from an ellipse one way to an ellipse other, which you can actually see as a rotation in the three-dimensional space instead of as a flipping back and forth. I'll show you these other ones later, but I can't resist showing them to you now. And this one's the perfect fifth. More on that later. So one-dimensional relationships between two frequencies can be understood as one component and another component in a two-dimensional space. So we can think of the first component A represented as big A or little a, and the second component B represented as big B or little b, and a positive correlation, a positive phase difference of 0 represents a positive correlation, that when you have big A, you have big B, and when you have little a, you have little b, whereas a negative correlation represents little a, little b, and big A, little b. The entire circle where things are undecided, that when you're decided, I'm undecided, and vice versa, that complete orbit represents all allowable combinations of states, the 2D relationship of two free bits. So the 4 different rows of a truth table, A is false, B is false, A is false, B is true, A is true, B is false, A is true, B is true. A particular point in time on that orbit represents a particular row of the truth table. And as we move through time, we get a different row of the truth table. Points in time represent rows of the truth table. Now, if we look at the orbit, which represents all combinations of states, and we take a fraction of that orbit, then we get some of the rows of the truth table, but not all of the rows of the truth table. A duration in time, therefore, gives us a function. A function is what are the allowable combinations of states in this fraction of time. And for all of the binary functions of two variables, from everything is false to everything is true, and all of the logical functions in between, there is a sector of time on this orbit that represents that function, except for those two rows, the rows which are non-linearly separable functions. You can't put one decision boundary across the two-dimensional feature space and get the opposite corners on the same side of the boundary without getting these two corners on the same side of the boundary. We already knew that from thinking about neural networks, but now we're doing it in phase space instead of in a static feature space. So non-linearly separable functions, XOR and if and only if, they need a higher order relationship, something that can't be represented with the circle. We need a higher dimensional orbit. So two components of the same frequency represent one relationship between two objects of the same frequency. But the octave, this is the second row of the Lissajous figures, that's two different frequencies in the 2-to-1 ratio. The 2-to-1 ratio, ba, 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 that's the octave, right? That's two different frequencies, one double the other. Somewhere. Combining those different frequencies adds a dimension to the orbit. Instead of being a two-dimensional circle rotating in a three-dimensional space, it's now a higher dimensional relationship rotating in this space. If we change the phase difference between the high frequency and the low frequency, we get these different shapes in the Lissajous patterns. So the octave orbit is a fold of the unison orbit. It's a two-dimensional fold in the third dimension. Here's a piece of wire I made into a circle. And if I fold the circle in the third dimension, it turns into something a bit like a Pringle. And if I project the Pringle at the particular angle, then the projection of that back into 2 dimensions gives you the figure 8 of the Lissajous figures. Now, that higher dimensional orbit we can think of as a higher energy particle, and the other folds, the other rows of the Lissajous figures, will come to those in a minute. But now we can represent a relationship between, we can represent 2 relationships instead of 1 relationship. We can represent a higher order relationship. But because they are harmonically related, it isn't 2 free relationships. It's not 4 bits. It's more like 2 entangled relationships. If you know one relationship, you know the other relationship. It's a higher order relation, a meta relation. Let me see if I can unpack that a little bit. So if you rotate that Pringle around, you get the figure 8 or the little curve, depending on which angle you're looking at it, what the phase difference is between the 2 frequencies. But the real thing, there's a great video where somebody's showing this on an oscilloscope with the 2 frequencies. And they say, oh, it looks 3-dimensional. Oh, don't worry about that. That's just an optical illusion. No, it isn't. It really is a 3-dimensional thing. You're just looking at a 2-dimensional projection of it. Each frequency that you add to the spectrum is a different dimension of the orbit that the thing is moving in. The real orbit doesn't have any kinks in it. It's equal curvature all over in a 3-dimensional space. It's the perfect 3-dimensional orbit. Any 2 points that are pi apart in phase are always the same distance from each other in that Pringle. Now, you can represent a non-linearly separable relationship with the Pringle that you can't represent with the circle. If you have XOR, for example, where the yellow stars at A is true and B is false, and A is false and B is true, you can't get those in the same part of the phase on the circle, but you can with the Pringle, because the Pringle is the folded over circle. So now there is a low-dimensional cut through that orbit that has those 2 states on the same side. A duration in the octave can represent non-linearly separable functions. And if I turn the Pringle around, it represents if and only if instead of XOR. Successive folds, folds on folds on folds, produce more complex waves, higher order functions. But instead of just thinking of it as a wave and adding another frequency and adding another frequency and adding another frequency, like we're doing a Fourier decomposition, but the frequencies could be anything, when you think of it as a fold, they have to be the overtones. They have to be particular frequencies so that it makes an orbit, so that when you go around in that frequency and you go around in this frequency, you end up back at the same point. You don't miss, right? If you miss, then you get an object that rotates, that they're not quite in harmonic relationship to one another. Each time you go around and back again, you don't get quite back to the same place. So it tends to rotate around as you go. So when you're adding these extra frequencies, you can think of the Fourier decomposition as adding extra dimensions. But when you're adding extra dimensions, which are harmonics, that's because they're orbits. And as you add extra dimensions, they are orbits in a higher dimensional space. The circle lives in a two-dimensional plane, but the Pringle lives in a three-dimensional space. So the 2D projection looks like a complicated curve with changing curvature, with kinks in it, but really they are higher dimensional orbits. They're curves of constant curvature in a high dimensional space that necessarily come back to where they started. Each curve has higher curvature, but it doesn't have any kinks. Like if you imagine a hollow sphere, like a hamster ball, and a flexible rod, like one of those curtain springs, and you pushed it through a hole in the ball, at first it would make a circle inside the ball, right? And then you push it in twice as length again, and it would create the Pringle, right? It would create the Pringle. Then you push it in again, and it folds over again. Except that the sphere is constraining it in a way which makes it a three-dimensional constraint, but really you need a four-dimensional constraint and then a five-dimensional constraint as you go down, so that it keeps the wire apart in all the dimensions in a fractal way. So each curve has a higher curvature but no kinks. These are like higher energy particles that can be ordered by the dimensionality of their orbits. I'll show you one more because that's the limit of what I can do with a piece of wire. So we go from the circle, which is two-dimensional, curve it around in the third dimension to make the Pringle, which viewed from the particular angle creates the figure eight. By the way, you can still view the figure eight from the other angle where it looks a bit like the circle, but with some wobbles on it, right? Now you take the figure eight and you squash it flat. I don't want to squash it flat, but I'm going to have to bend it again. And I can't bend things in the fourth dimension. So I'll squash the three-dimensional object back down to 2 and then bend that. So the two-dimensional is a proper flat 8. I can fold the 8 over and I can still see the higher frequency, right? I go around this circle twice for each time I went round the original circle. You've got the 2-to-1 relationship in the figure 8, and they're all going around the same way. They're not going in round this way and then round clockwise and anti-clockwise, right? When you fold it over, they're all going clockwise. Anyway, now instead of flattening it completely like that, if we just bend the figure 8 slowly around onto itself until one side of the figure 8 begins to overlap with the other side of the figure 8, now we get the perfect fifth, the 2-to-3 ratio, which is illustrated on this oscilloscope, right? And if we look at that from different angles, if we look at that from the top, it still has a circle going around 3 times. But if we look at it from this side, we can see the Lissajous figure of the figure 8, which if you squash flat, gives the 2-dimensional form of the 3-dimensional shape, which was really a 3-dimensional curve of something that was already a 3-dimensional shape, but we squashed it down a dimension each time we went up. So each time you go up, you sort of, in order to illustrate it in 3-dimensional space, I'm squashing out a dimension so that I can fold it again, and then squashing out a dimension so that I can fold it again. But we're really moving into a higher dimensional orbit as we do each fold. So that 3-dimensional object is here projected into 3 dimensions, the piece of wire, which is then projected into 2 dimensions so that I can draw it on a 2-dimensional screen. And changes in phase, the rotation of the object of that 3-dimensional object, or 4-dimensional object, is a change in frequency of the 2-dimensional object, because they're folded up. Changes in phase at one level is a change in frequency at the other level. You can see this because if you take that same object, that's the same object, the same 3-dimensional object, and turn it around, you can see that there's a projection shown in the shadow of the 2/3 frequency and the 1/3 frequency that combines together to create the 2-3 ratio of the perfect fifth. I was going to sing the perfect fifth, but I'll leave it to you. Da, 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 da. That's the perfect fifth. So now that's what songs are: perfect orbits in higher dimensional spaces. They're orbits in higher dimensional spaces with no kinks when they have the harmonics, right? That they still connect back up to each other. Now, when we move everything to phase space like that, now we need to talk about how things interact. We don't have any static particles. We only have waves. We need to talk about how two songs interact, songs in whatever medium they're in. And there isn't any network of connections between particles. There's no springs connecting masses. There's only changing associations between songs, which is the harmonization process. And the basic interaction is about getting in phase, is about resonance, is about phase locking. Resonance pulls oscillators into phase, and the strength of the pull is proportional to the similarity of the frequencies. Not just how different the frequencies are, but how harmonious the frequencies are. Because if you have one frequency and another frequency that's the same, they pull strongly. If you have one frequency and another frequency that's a bit different from that, they almost can't see each other. But then you go further to a frequency that's twice as much, and now they can see each other again. So the strength of the pull is not just the absolute difference in frequency, it's the harmonic difference in frequency. Which harmonic are they? And when two songs meet, here's two oscillators, two circles, that projected into each projected into a two-dimensional relationship. What does one song see of the other song? Well, the projection of oscillator A onto the behavior of oscillator B is the inner product, which if they are orthogonal is 0, they just annihilate each other. But that's what they see in the short term. But let's wait a little bit. Let's wait long enough for them to get in phase. What does that mean? When they get in phase, it means they change from being orthogonal to being the same. They change from being in contradiction to being in agreement. The contradictions are resolved by turning the relationship in a higher dimension to reduce the phase difference. To do that, you need to open up an extra dimension. You go from a line to the circle to the line again. You open up into an extra dimension, and then you collapse it back down again if it resolves. If they're really the same thing, but in a different phase, then you turn them around in the third dimension, but they collapse back down into the lower dimensional space. The effect of that is that the phase of one of them turns around to match the phase of the other. It's as though I thought I was different from you because the projection of you onto me was 0. But really, we're the same. It's just we're the same but turned around. So that means we're the same frequency, but we're different phase. It's like the magnitude of 1 is equal to the magnitude of -1. How does that happen? Well, it's because they're not really one-dimensional lines. They were both really two-dimensional circles. And the symmetry breaking is you can just see a little bit of the edge of the circle, which means that there's a slight wobble in that inner product. And that reveals the extra dimension that breaks symmetry, and the stress of the wobble transfers the energy between the two, causing their phase to become aligned. Of course, it's not really that one of them stays still and the other one comes into agreement with it or turns to it, is that the both of them turn towards each other. It's just here I was drawing it in the fixed frame of reference of the first one. So they were never really two different things. They were really always two things in a higher dimensional relationship. And when they were resonating and changing phase, they were always this two-dimensional relationship that we're now just looking at from another angle, which when projected back down, oh, I see, they're the same, really. They looked like they were the opposite sign, and they are the opposite sign, but they're really the same magnitude. So if we look at our relationship from one angle, we look different, but if we look at it from another angle, we look the same. Resonance turns things to the projection where they look the same, where it's a simpler model of what they are. So that's two frequencies meeting each other of the same frequency and resonating. What happens when they're unrelated frequencies, when they're not harmonic? That means neither one looks stationary to the other. That means that the inner product is going to be oscillating back and forth. That's the beating between two different frequencies. As the frequencies get more and more different, the rotation gets faster and faster with respect to each other. And that means that sometimes they're pulling and sometimes they're pulling this way and sometimes they're pulling that way. And there isn't any consistent pull. It's like they just can't see each other. But if they move to the next harmonic, the 2-to-1 ratio, for example, then harmonic related, then they can see each other again. The octave produces a consistent pull on every turn of the fundamental, and 2 octaves produces a consistent pull on every 4th turn of the fundamental. Other way around. Other way around. Now, what happens when two complex songs that aren't the same, or when two complex songs like 2 octaves meet each other? What happens when 2 intervals interact, right? We're recursing. We did how when 2 values meet each other and then 2 relationships meet each other, and now we've got 2 two-dimensional relationships meet each other. When two different complex oscillations with a complex wave pattern, they are higher dimensional orbits, they are higher dimensional particles reacting with each other. We're doing a chemistry of songs. The conjecture is that in the short term, each sees the projection of the other onto themselves, the inner product. But in the longer term, they turn around to align with each other, and the two songs, if they're the same kind, turn more strongly, whereas two songs that are unrelated to each other don't really see each other very much and don't have much turning force. Two different songs turn less strongly according to how many frequency components match. So this is the octave, fundamental and twice the frequency, in two different phases, π/3 apart. These two different phases, when what they see of each other at first is, one is up, the other is down, one is down, and the other is up. The difference between those, the magnitude of the difference between those is quite high. From that position of π/3 apart, they could move towards being completely in phase, in which case they would cancel out. There'd be no difference between them. Or there's another local minimum at being π apart. Being π apart is less difference between them than the π/3, but it's not collapsed down to 0. Π apart is stable. Why is it stable? It's like it's turned it into a bit which has two different states, right? The subharmonic phase locking can be used to represent bits and of least significant bits, next significant bits, next significant bit, most significant bits as you add different octaves on top. But that turning around into getting in phase is just energy minimization. It's just relaxing, right? Those two songs meet each other. Their reaction is that they either produce nothing, they annihilate, they form unison, or they form the pi out of phase is stable. In complex waves that aren't harmonic, one frequency is going to dominate, and that's going to mean that their relationship is sort of scale specific. But in complex waves that have harmonic relationships, all of the frequencies get involved in that rotation simultaneously. The fundamental in this one and the fundamental in that one are rotating into phase, and the extra dimensions, the high frequency in this one and the high frequency in this one, they're getting involved too, and they're pulling into phase. All the different frequencies are fully engaged, top up and bottom, and top down and bottom up. They're all involved in that relationship. The turning in each frequency is like a turning in a different orthogonal dimension, which enables it to happen parallel and quickly. That you turn the fundamental phase to match, you turn the octave to match, you turn the two octaves to match, and so on. But, and this is what makes it interesting, they're not really orthogonal dimensions. They're not really independent. Because if one is a factor of the other, they can see each other through the harmonics. Changing the phase of the 2F can be seen in a wobble in changing the phase of the fundamental. Musical geometry is non-Cartesian. It isn't really the case that you can think of the fundamental and then the octave as separate dimensions. They are really in the same higher dimensional space simultaneously. So you have this idea that they are a multi-dimensional thing, that this frequency is different from that frequency and they're incommensurate, they're like orthogonal components. But you also have this idea that they're projected into lower dimensions, where ultimately it's just like a scalar and you can just add them up. Everything is commensurate with everything else. It's all just one waveform. You just add them up if you want. But they have this sort of pseudo-digital, pseudo-multidimensional character to them. That's what makes them interesting. That means that when you change one component, it produces rotations on the other components. The song is turned around in a high-dimensional space. And rotating a song, taking that three-dimensional curve, which I did with the wire, and turning it around, you can see different factors of the shape of the orbit as you turn it around. And as you see those different factors, you're presenting a different factor of the song to the camera, the original frame of reference. The camera is the other song, right? What's the inner product of this song with that song? Well, if I turn that song around, I can see the other factors of it. And to me, well, that just looks like 2F because I'm 2F, I see 2F, right? I'm in this phase, I see that phase, and it turns around so that it's phase locked to it. But there's more going on in this one. This is a higher dimensional thing. I can't really see that. If I'm a low dimensional stroboscope, I can't see the higher dimensional stuff there. I just see it as a in the dimensions, the frequencies that I can see. I can't see that it's really a high dimensional thing with curvature. I see low dimensional things as best as I can approximate it, which might have some kinks and wobbles on it if it's not properly turned around for my frame of reference. That's what I meant by showing you that piece of wire and showing it from different angles so that you can see the components of the frequencies which are in it. So changing orientation, phase, rotating a high dimensional object in a high dimensional space changes its identity. It changes what frequency is the fundamental frequency to that when viewed from an original frame of reference. The high dimensional songs meet each other and resonate. They turn around to get in phase with each other without losing who they are, without getting squashed. They're just being turned around. But to a low dimensional phasoscope, they look like a low dimensional object that has changed type, that they changed from a circle to a figure eight. But to a high dimensional phasoscope, you can see, oh, this is just two Pringles finding a way for the two Pringles to fit together. But if a circle meets a Pringle, then it just, I can just see this wobbly circle and this pure circle that goes around this one in a wobbly way in the same amount of time as going around this one in a smooth way. So they can resonate. This fundamental can see the fundamental of the octave, but it's not seeing the full picture. So in one orientation, a particular song might not resonate with another song, but in another orientation, they might resonate strongly. So this means that you can do different steps of your reaction, right? By one song meets another song and it turns it around. And now that it's turned around, that song can interact with the third song, which it couldn't interact with before because it was in the wrong orientation. So from the frame of reference, a fixed frame of reference, it will appear as a quantized change in frequency that it flips into the other dimension to find that phase locking, and thus appear as a quantized change in frequency of A, and thus a change in the strength of the resonance between A and B, a change in the strength of the connection. And it's the change in the strength of the connection which we needed for a learning process. So all of this was about how can it be the case that if the strength of the spring is about the difference in the frequencies, and the difference in the frequencies controls how strongly they resonate, that's the elastic part of their connection, how can it be that that actually changes the strength of their connection? Because we need the process that changes their strength of the connection to be, wait a minute, it needs to be the same thing in another level. It's just another turning around in a higher dimensional space. In other words, learning is just higher order phase change. So harmonization of when a high frequency object synchronizes with a lower frequency object, when they're getting into phase with one another and phase locking, they're doing a differential easing of the frustrated relationships between those different levels of organization. And now movements in one are coupled to movements in the other. If I change a little bit of phase of the fundamental, it changes a little bit of phase of the 2F with it. They become locked together in the particular orientation that they've locked to. That harmonization is recursive, upwards and downwards through different scales. And the intuition then is that recursive harmonization is equivalent to recursive natural induction, that you have a sort of upward compression through upward phase locking and decompression through downward phase locking. And the turning around that happens in the lower degrees of scale, lower degrees of freedom, produces an informed turning around, non-local harmonization, quantized jumps in the higher degrees of freedom in the decompressed one. So the conjecture is then that songs provide a substrate for cognition by implementing a kind of recursive natural induction, that harmonizing songs are different ways of doing computation in phase space. It's a deep computation that's all transformational. And it's also a matter program that self-learns, self-corrects, and self-propagates in a scale invariant and substrate independent way that's spontaneous, it's inherent to physics, and they retain that connection upwards and downwards. You know, you can tell that I don't have a working model of this, right? I don't have a working model of recursive harmonization. But I do have a model of a component which is important. I have a model that changes the scale of optimization using only changes in phase without any selection. The change of phase in this model is proportional to the magnitude of the stress between them, the amount of wobble, the amount of buzz that they feel. And the more two things interact, the more they change phase such that they interact more in future. So the aim of this model is to show that by using only changes in phase, I can describe a dynamical system that changes how it behaves from following individual gradients, which are unable to follow the global gradient, to following global gradients, which ignore the individual gradients. So it's going to be a model about drivers and which side of the road they drive on, and getting them to change in a manner that opposes their short-term individual interest in order to arrive at a state that satisfies their long-term collective interest, which is what it means to act in a goal-directed way. In other words, it's a transition to a higher level of agency from individual drivers to collectives of drivers. So there's a simple scenario to aid our thinking, is which countries drive on which side of the road. So assume that individual drivers are nudged to one side or the other by the collisions that they experience. We can think of that as just a ball rolling downhill that gets nudged by driver 2 to land in a different local equilibrium from the undecided state to the decided state. We can model that as an amplifier that either gets nudged upwards or nudged downwards and does a big response to the small nudge. Now we need to repeatedly redecide. We repeatedly put the ball back to the top of the hill and let it roll down again, put it back to the top of the hill and let it roll down again, and so on. This is the clock. So we have a clock that's about deciding left or right and another clock that's about returning to the undecided state. So the decider repeatedly returns to the sensitive state and decides again. So we have first time it might go to the left, the second time it might go to the right. It's been brought back to the saddle point, to the sensitive point. Now within a country, it's easy for drivers to arrive at a consensus by positive feedback. Like the more of them that are driving on the left, the more I get involved in collisions if I'm not driving on the left. So the more nudges I get for me to drive on the left as well. So I agree with the strong forces of the locals. But it's not possible for an individual to change to resolve the collisions with occasional foreigners. So if country 1 is driving on the left and country 2 is driving on the right, then an individual that's driving on the right, who's clearly the wrong side, could change to driving on the left so that it doesn't crash into the foreigners. But the connections with the drivers in their own country are so strong that it just pulls it back. It's not possible for an individual to change to resolve the collisions with the occasional foreigners due to the greater cost of collisions with the locals. Now, countries as a whole are in an aggregate sense incentivized to agree with the majority of other countries, just like individuals are incentivized to agree with the majority of other locals. But a country isn't a thing that can make decisions. A country isn't a thing that is responsive. A country is not a thing. It's not a level that can respond or be sensitive because the internal components are holding it where it is. It's like it's in a gutter and it doesn't have any sensitivity to change, to being moved, to have that flexibility or agility to move in different ways. Okay, so let's model 30 countries of 10 drivers each. Pairs of drivers in the same country meet each other much more often than foreigners meet each other, which means you get local agreement or a Nash equilibrium, which is a local optimum in terms of total collisions. That's the vertical axis is total collisions. So there's a global solution with everybody driving on the left globally and everybody driving on the right globally. And then there are these local optima, 2 to the 30 of them, for the different combinations in which countries, where everybody within every country is driving on the same side as everybody else in their country, but not the same side as other countries are. So there's a sort of two-scale dynamics here, a dynamical system with an equation of motion that's described by a weighted sum of local and global forces. The local energy landscape is created by strong local interactions. You fall towards the local majority, the more drivers agree, the better. But there's also a global energy landscape created by relatively weak non-local interactions, which incentivize falling towards the global majority. The more countries that agree, the better. But you can't get there. because rolling downhill in the micro energy landscape just takes you to a local minimum. You can't roll downhill in the global landscape because that would require going over energy barriers. That's what we want to do. We want to roll downhill in the macro energy landscape. If only countries could respond to, i.e. roll downhill, the macro scale landscape like individual drivers do to the micro scale landscape, then we'd be able to get to the global majority. But countries aren't able to respond to one another like individual drivers are. Between those 2 points, those 2 local minima, 10 drivers need to change at once. They must all change at the same time. How could that happen? Doing better than a local optimum requires moving through intermediate points of higher energy where there's more conflict in a specific way, right? I don't just want to go through more conflict and have another go and end up in agreeing with the global minority, which would be higher in energy. I want to go downwards in energy. If you could do that in a process that was flipped upside down, you'd say, look, it's getting off the local adaptive peak and it's moving upwards to the next highest adaptive peak, not just by shocking it so that it goes somewhere different, which could just as easily go down as going up. It needs to go the right way. It needs to be goal-directed, going uphill, not downhill. Okay, so now let's talk about phase. All of these individual drivers, 1 driver per column here, 300 columns, downwards through time. Dark blue is driving on the left, yellow is driving on the right, or whatever, doesn't matter. And the medium blue is I'm not decided. I'm not driving on either side right now. In that undecided state, I'm sensitive to what the local majority is doing. And I'm a little bit sensitive to what the foreigners are doing, but not so much. The system quickly becomes trapped at a local Nash, a local equilibrium, where each stripe of 10 drivers is in agreement, but neighboring stripes are not necessarily in agreement. There isn't really any neighborhood here. It's just 10 drivers in a country, 30 countries in the world. They're not really next to each other in a one-dimensional space. Redeciding results in the same outcome. If I zoom in on that, these are deciding, well, do you want to drive on the left or do you want to drive on the right? They go back to the top of the hill and decide again. But they make the same decision over and over again because the local majority is still doing the same thing. They can't make a different decision. If I synchronize everybody, that doesn't help either. So everybody redecides at the same time and they just make a different random solution. It's just like, okay, like everybody stop. Okay, everybody have another go. And you just end up with everybody in the local countries agrees, but the countries don't agree with each other. So that's not it. What we really need is that we need to allow phase change according to the strength of the stress that they experience, so that being out of phase with the locals is most important. So those units synchronize first. That's just the principle of coupled oscillators in training to each other to decrease the difference in phase. If we allow that to happen, then in the close-up, you can see that initially they are out of phase within a block, and then they become in phase so that they are redeciding at the same time. And when they redecide at the same time, the whole block can change. The country redecides as a unit instead of redesigning as individual drivers. That enables the whole system to find the global optimum from any initial condition just by changing the phase of the redeciding, so that it rolls downhill in the global energy landscape or uphill in the global fitness landscape, if you prefer to think it as uphill, which means that the country is now able to respond to forces that it wasn't previously sensitive to. When it was disorganized inside, that's all that it could see. But when it gets aligned inside, in that moment where everybody is undecided at the same time, who are they going to be pulled by? Well, the only thing that's doing anything is the foreigners. So in that moment, they get pulled by the global majority, and that makes them able to respond in a way that individual components couldn't, because it moved against their short-term incentives. And that leads to configurations that makes more components happy in the long term than they could if they were acting individually. So there's a change in the level of agency just by changing phase. A system of linked primitive deciders that synchronize the timing of their decisions by simple resonance phase locking shows a transition in agency in the sense that there's an origination of an ability to respond to inputs that it didn't previously have. A country couldn't respond to the foreigners, but now it can. A country wasn't a thing that could make a decision, but now it can. That new sensitivity is not arbitrary. It's not just random variation and selection at the country level. It moves systematically and specifically in the direction that increases long-term collective welfare. In that sense, it's goal-directed. And individuals are caused thereby to take decisions that increase the welfare of a specific collective in a way that's opposed by individual action if it was unsynchronized. In other words, it's a new level of agency that's serving long-term collective interests instead of short-term individual interests. Right. So how does synchronization change the behavior? Because resonance, changes in phase, doesn't tell them what to decide. It only tells them when to decide. But it turns out that's the same thing. When units are in a sensitive state, they don't exert forces on one another. But when everybody in a country is in the undecided state, no one inside the country is committed to anything. None of the inside the country have any influence on each other. But in that state, they have sensitivity to the weak forces from outside the country, and they're all pulled the same way towards the global majority. As they swing away from that neutral point, they pull on each other again and commit more strongly. They rebuild the higher frequency interactions, the higher frequency resonance, which is strong enough to then pull other countries into their sensitive state, and so on. If everyone is undecided at different times, each redecision is dominated by the locals. If everyone globally is undecided at the same time, global synchronization, then there isn't any global majority for them to agree with. But when they're synchronized within blocks but not between, the individuals are momentarily protected from the strong internal forces of others in their own group, but they're not protected from the external forces that they're not synchronized with, which enables them to see the global gradient, and they're caused by the weak external forces to go the right way downhill. Notice that there isn't any deliberation. There isn't any trial and error. There isn't any, let's try it this way and let's try it that way and see which one is best. It's just rolling downhill. But the changes in phase enables it to roll downhill in the macro landscape instead of in the micro landscape. I think this is related to Dennis's notion of harnessing the stochasticity from the levels below. By getting them in phase with one another, it creates agency at the next level up. So that inner alignment model, as we call it, is about changing internal phase. Changing internal phase changes the actions and the level of agency, which is relevant to the system. The resonance changes when they take actions, not directly influencing which actions they take, but nonetheless that can affect a multi-scale behavior that picks out particular subsets of agents to work together. And that can cause them to move against their local energetic forces in the short term and enable them to respond to relatively weak signals that lead to the global optimum in the long term. In other words, they're moving in the implicate order instead of in the explicate order. That mechanism has problem-solving capabilities that are significantly superior to the viscoelastic network model that I did in the Springs. The internal organization that's induced has the effect of rescaling the problem-solving dynamic from a gradient process in the state space of the original variables to a gradient process in the state space of the emergent group variables. In effect, this changes the adjacent possible in the system, enabling the system to jump from one local minimum to another at state configurations that are better without visiting the poor quality solutions in between. Why? Because it's moving in a higher dimensional space. Its new organization, who's in phase with who, holds knowledge, specific structure about the environment. The environment was the original setup of the strengths of connections between the drivers. And that makes it able to respond to new influences. It causes it to find better solutions to the constraints between components by reducing frustrated interactions. That makes more subagents happy at the same time. The meta-agents is defined by satisfying the goals of the subagents more than they can when disorganized. It's sort of top up and it's sort of bottom down because it's bottom up. I said that the wrong way around. It's bottom up because it's the frustrations between the individual drivers that get them into phase. But now they're in phase, it defines a new point of articulation for the macro scale to move in. So let's come back to our list of desiderata. We have deep, recursive, reversible induction. We have abstraction, many instances corresponding to one concept, folding the space. We have underdetermination, that the learning is inductive, not just an impression. We have agential movements, caused by ordinary movements in the implicate order, which makes it look like they're pendulums swinging faster. It has a recursive linguistic competence. These structures, those higher dimensional orbits, the perfect ratios, they're related to the Fibonacci sequence, right? They're folds on folds on folds on folds. That linguistic competence is the number space of harmonic relationships. But they're not just data structures, they're active. They do stuff when one number meets another, when one ratio meets another, when one high dimensional orbit meets another, they apply forces to one another. And they arise spontaneously from nothing. All you need to do is heat it up and stuff just finds harmonic relationships. What haven't we done? We haven't done what the prime directive is. So what's the prime mover? It isn't variation and selection. It isn't differential survival and reproduction. The phase locking in the inner alignment model, there isn't any incentive to reward or to learn how to move away from a local optimum. There isn't anything that rewards being able to move towards the global optimum. It's organizing itself in a manner that enables this higher level sensitivity. They move into resonance with one another before they get that benefit, right? They're moving towards one another before they're able to do the higher level jump. So why does it do it then? Well, the differential easing of frustrations between coupled redeciders, the repeated decisions, results in a collapse of the dimensionality within the system. That buzzing mess of drivers frantically interacting with one another within the country is momentarily taken out of the picture. They're momentarily relaxed. There's like an ebb and flow to it. And that necessarily makes it more sensitive to whatever is happening outside it. It redefines the boundary, the identity, in a way that's determined by the history of the system. In other words, the identity of the system is being redefined by a transformative learning process. So you ask, if it's not a result of selection or reward, does that mean it's just a fortuitous side effect, a byproduct, or worse, an intended side effect that was designed by me to do the right thing? I don't get it. How can it be? How can anything do the right thing without being selected to do the right thing? Well, in the same sense that the ability of a learning system to generalize correctly is a side effect of experience, yeah, it is a sort of side effect, right? Induction is always a side effect. The ability to generalize correctly on the test set was not directly selected for because it's the test set. It couldn't have been directly selected for because you haven't seen it yet. It's the side effect of changing the internal organization in a way that agrees with the training data. So in that sense, it's a side effect. But you don't say, oh, look, it generalized this picture of a cat correctly, even though it had never seen this picture of a cat before. That must be dumb luck. No, you say, that's what learning is. That's what generalization is. All induction is a side effect of what's happened in the past. But learning in the sense of collapsing the degrees of freedom spontaneously by easing the frustrations between things, by turning things around to remove their stress, is a particular kind of inductive bias. It's a natural inductive bias of finding low-dimensional models, not just the number of orthogonal parameters they have, but low-dimensional in a fractal sense, right? Of dimensions inside dimensions inside dimensions inside dimensions. We are all composed of elements in the same key. We're all fractions of the same whole. And that inductive bias makes it possible for one system to do successful induction on another system. If they are from a completely different key, they won't be able to do that induction. They won't be able to even see each other. They will just be discordant, banging up against one another. I can't turn around. I don't know what you're doing. It doesn't make any sense to me. I get crushed and I have catastrophic failure, or I can't see it. But if we're in the same key, right? If we're built from the same fundamental frequency and the fractions thereof, then we will be the kinds of systems that can turn around to meet each other. This, I think, is what Bohm means by everything is connected, right? Everything is connected because everything is written in the same key. It's compatible with a minimizing surprise framework from Friston, Free Energy Principle. But the emphasis is on mutual alignment rather than a sort of one-way thing of like, I'm a thing in the world and I'm trying to minimize the surprise that the world puts on me. It's like, yeah, that's true. But it's also true for the components inside me and the symmetry breaking that happens inside me. And it's also true for me and you together, me and the environment. The environment is another agent interacting with me. We are being pressed by the fundamental, the frequency that's double, that's half that, right? The slower frequency that's placing a constraint on us. So it's compatible with that, but it's not just one way and it's fractal. There's a particular physics to it that produces that compatibility of that sort of in between things being multiple orthogonal dimensions and things being all one scalar. We have a sort of fractal dimension where things are able to turn around, but they're still able to see each other. They can be different, but they're built from the same stuff. That's a particular physics. It needs a particular physics to do it, but a particular physics does it deeply and easily, or at least that's the idea. So a way to understand what the prime mover is harmonization, seeking harmonic relations, seeking agreement, seeking the reduction of frustration. The twist is that the geometry that maintains internal integrity as much as possible is a turning around of the same shape in a high-dimensional space, not just being like water, right? If it was just like water, then you'd be saying, oh, let's just remove all the frustrations. Let's just not be anything, right? Let's not push back at all. But that ebb and flow, that give and take between having an internal integrity with needs and wants and being fluid, being able to turn around, being able to change your geometry, that give and take, seeking harmonic relationships, seeking agreement in that space is seeking harmonic relationships. So you have a system that has internal integrity, but it's still able to transform in a language of possibilities defined by those harmonic relationships, the fractal relationships. It's able to transform when it's pushed. I'm wanting to move this towards a calculus of life, a new theory of living things, their origin and their adaptation that unifies development, cognition, and adaptation, the shape and form and geometry and organization of structures, because they're really just slow changing variables, memory, recall, induction, deduction, recognizing, generating, learning, and agential behavior, and learning to optimize better with experience by relaxation in a higher order space that produces a problem-solving competence. I think that those can all be unified in a way that provides top-down causation, where entities are actors, not just products of the lower level processes. And it's fundamentally scale invariant, that causes and adaptation and cognition and agency at all scales can act downwards as well as upwards. And it unifies its organization and dynamics, program and data intertwined. I was talking about that calculus of life that unifies those things. I don't have that calculus, but that's what I'm working towards. That calculus has a sort of dimensionality or a geometry that isn't fixed. There isn't a fixed geometry into which music fits. It's more like a geometry that it makes up as it goes along. You play the first note that constrains the space of possibilities of what the second note can be. When you play the second note, it constrains the space abilities of what the third note can be. And as the notes recede in time, the geometry of that space begins to close up again. And each note you add to a song opens up new dimensions, which defines a space of constraints, but also allows other particular notes to fit into it, and some not, and some fit and some don't. And it's impermanent, it's dynamic. As the song develops through time, the dimensions close and collapse and new ones open up, inviting the next note, creating its own path, way-making, as a shout out to Andrea Hyatt again. There's a balance between a progression of forced moves, which are determined, conservative contractions, and symmetry breaking moves, which are unforced, underdetermined, innovative, creative, and expansive. And we're progressively moving back and forth between the forced moves and the symmetry breaking moves in that geometric space. And that's what the calculus needs to capture. So now we just need to wrap up with the conclusions. We are nearly there. Last part. So putting this all together, the idea is that we have agency at all levels of organization that interacts downwards to the agentic components of which things are constructed, that push upwards to create agentic components at the next level of organization, which are interacting with other agents at that same level of organization to form relationships which are agential at the next level of organization, and so on upwards and downwards. That agency occurs at all levels of biological systems that have harmonic relationships, from ecological down to molecular. And how agential it is will depend on how tightly knit the dynamics are over different levels of organization, how harmonic they are. Let's take a moment to discuss what role is left for natural selection, or how do natural induction and natural selection relate to one another. Well, natural selection occurs, and biological evolution wouldn't happen without it. It's essential. But does that mean that natural selection explains biological evolution? Well, consider. Suppose we had a theory that cognition was explained by a theory of electricity, and our theory of electricity described how current flows, potential difference, resistance, and the relationships between them, etc. Well, current does flow inside brains, and it's essential for cognition to occur. It's also essential for cognition to occur in machine learning systems, for that matter. But is it sufficient to say that a theory of electricity does all the explaining I need for cognition? Clearly not. We need to understand the organization. So what's the algorithm of biological evolution? Suppose we have a theory of natural selection that describes the gradient following processes of allele frequency changes under selective coefficients. Well, natural selection occurs. You go poking around in a population and you say, yeah, natural selection's happening here. And it's essential for evolution. It's a causal part of the process. Yeah. But does natural selection do all the explaining that you need? I don't think so. In fact, the amount of explaining that's missing is exactly the same as the amount of explaining that's missing between a theory of electricity and a theory of cognition. A theory of natural selection is correct, just like a theory of electricity is correct. In fact, they say pretty much similar things, that things go where they're pushed. But it doesn't say very much, that when things are pushed, they tend to go in the direction that they're pushed. The selective coefficients change the allele frequencies, the potential differences cause the current to flow. But what we really wanted to explain was the cognition, because that's where the biological adaptation happens, or the machine adaptation if we were talking about artificial intelligence. Selection, the differential survival and reproduction, occurs. It's causal at a given scale with given selective conditions, variability, and heritability, but it can't explain its own constraints and affordances and why they work so well. Induction, learning process through differential easing of frustrated relationships, harmonization, also occurs in physical systems. And that's causal at all scales, with complex interdependencies between the scales, where each scale creates and constraints on itself and on the levels above and below. It's a self-referential metadynamical system. And a system which is self-referential at one scale doesn't explain anything. That's just a complex dynamical system. That's just like saying the evolution of evolvability is just evolution. If you think about it at one scale, just at the genetic scale, yeah, it's just evolution. The genes change, and the ones which confer a fitness benefit are retained, and the ones that don't. But when you have a self-referential process at multiple scales, where one slow-changing scale produces constraints on others, and vice versa, that's where it gets interesting, and that's what we're trying to describe here. So let's return to our motivating questions. What are living things? Where's the design information held? Where does the design information come from? What makes it so smart? Who's in charge here? And, briefly, what does it all mean? Well, the orthodox story is that information is held at the bottom, and everything else is produced by that. But in this account, information is held at every level of the hierarchy. The bottom scale isn't privileged in holding the information. Where does the information come from? In the conventional story, it comes from the scale of evolutionary units only. Evolutionary units are the only scale of thing that can be adapted. There's no feedback between intermediate levels, and there's no feedback at levels above evolutionary units. loose social groups, biological communities, and biosphere as a whole can't be adapted. But in this view, all levels can be sources of adaptive information through direct induction, through interaction with the environment, at all levels in a scale invariant way. Who's in charge? In the orthodox view, there's upward causation only. The genes are in charge, and they determine everything that happens. In this view, there's upward and downward causation. Things pushing downward on the levels below. The stress that's accommodated at one level of organization has a remainder that's taken up by stress in the level of organization below, and the level of organization below determines the kind of changes which are possible at the level of organization above. What makes it so smart? Well, memory, learning, and adaptation, there's a deep model of induction. They're causal models that are embedded and empowered, and they're all natural properties of physical resonant harmonics. And when conditioned into harmonic relations, through interaction at the next scale, creates natural cognition that knows more, that gets smarter with experience. And natural cognition orchestrates genetic evolution. It isn't a product of it. Natural inductive bias comes from universality, that we're all made of the same stuff. We're all fractions of the same fundamental. We're all composites vibrating in the same key. You can think of us as being made of the same stuff, that we're all made out of the same kind of atoms, which are all made out of the same kind of quarks. Or you can think of, well, all of the atoms are fractions of the same fundamental. So organisms are songs, evolution is a song, you're a song, everything's a song. So what? What does it mean to you or I? Does it change our view of ourselves in relation to the universe? Does it change what we value and what's good? Well, I think it means we're not lumbering robots controlled by our genes. And it means that competitive exclusion, selection, is not the real driver of creative change. It's a driver at any particular level of organization. Yeah, things roll downhill. But the real creative change comes from the multiple scales, where instead of what persists exists, what relates creates. The real creativity is not from how a system changes to facilitate its persistent survival or reproduction. It's the dance that it and its environment do together, transforming each other into a new song with complementary parts. This doesn't just winnow from what's already there, it creates something new, a coherent structure at a level that wasn't there before. Or was it there before? You just needed to turn it around so that you could see it. So what does it all mean? Let's look again at the meaning of the conventional narrative, which I would call a sense-eliminating narrative rather than a sense-making narrative. The original narrative is that all the adaptive complexity of living things is a product of encoded information, mostly in genes, acquired by the mechanism of evolution by natural selection. The process is driven by differential survival and reproduction. The prime mover is self-preservation. Organisms and their dynamical behaviors are products of this process, not actors in the process. So any cognition, intelligence, or agency of living things, which is very rare and exceptional anyway, is not relevant to how evolution works. The adaptive process is uninformed. Any sense of meaning that we attach to our lives is therefore immaterial. Relationships and feelings and how we interact with one another at a scale that is meaningful to us, experienced at our human scale, is entirely irrelevant. We are irrelevant to the mechanisms of evolutionary creation. Only survival and reproduction matter. They're the real causes and consequences, and they're all molecular. In fact, we in all things, animate and inanimate, are devoid of any meaning or any intrinsic value beyond the truism that what persists exists. So here's a different narrative, which I would call a sense-making narrative. All the adaptive complexity of living things participates in, orchestrates, and constitutes the process of creation via mechanisms of natural harmonic induction. The process is driven by harmonizing forces inherent to all dynamical systems and interactions between them. It's a multi-scale differential easing of frustrations. The prime mover is harmonization. The dynamical behaviors of organisms and their relationships are agents in that process. The cognition, intelligence, and agency of living things, which, by the way, is universal to all life, not just us, constitutes that process. It's not just a product of that process, it is that process. The adaptive process is informed by every experience and memory held within them and between them. Our sense of meaning, our relationships and feelings experienced are therefore, in modest ways, materially causal. We are part of the process of creation. Our actions matter to creation, in modest ways, and our basal and conceptual intelligence are causal factors. All things originate themselves and their own meaning together within a universal dance connected through all scales, where transformative connections are central. What relates creates. That's what I think it means. So to conclude, living things are songs. They are resonant dynamics at all physical and temporal scales, from the organismic to cellular to molecular, linked together through harmonic relations. That multi-scale interlock pattern is the song of the organism. It's cognitive at all levels, providing memory, learning, adaptive plasticity, problem-solving competence. And the organismic song orchestrates the activity of the genes and their evolution, pushing down as well as the genes pushing up. Songs are algorithms of adaptation that orchestrate evolution, and that is the cognition-first theory of life that I wanted to share with you.